Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, an anechoic emulsion of erratic extremes, ever at war with one another, here to talk to you today about the nature of oppositions. We are experiencing two oppositions in transit at the moment, Venus in opposition to Saturn and Sun in opposition to Pluto. And rather than do separate videos about both of them, due to lack of time, I thought I would do a video philosophizing on the nature of opposites and dualities in astrology in general. So if you will indulge me and the elaborate allegories that I will no doubt employ to bring this subject to life, let us proceed. Let's begin by defining what exactly is an aspect in astrology. An aspect is a geometric depiction of the relationship between two planets. And in all the sum of different aspects that we have in this big 360 circle of possible connections that two planets can have with one another, we roughly divide them into the harmonious and the disharmonious. And I think a lot of people have come to the simple conclusion that harmonious aspects are nice and pleasant and cheerful and easygoing, and that the disharmonious aspects represent bad or negative things. But it's not that simple. Really, on a purely neutral, objective level, harmonious aspects indicate that two planets get along easily with one another, whereas when there is a disharmonious aspect, two planets resist one another. But the allegory I want to employ to bring this all to life is, imagine, if you will, that the natal chart, or the chart of the heavens in general, is a great big dinner party of which you are the hostess. You have a list of all of the invited guests, which are the different planets. You know their different characters, you know their histories, their temperaments, the relations of all the people who are coming, who knows each other, who doesn't know one another. And from this, you try and draw up a plan of where everyone should be seated. And like a good hostess, you look at certain people and say, yes, they should be clustered together. Others should be kept as far away from one another as possible. So in this scenario, we'll look at how the aspects will be placed at this dinner party one by one. So the conjunction is when two planets are placed closely together. They are seated so closely together they have effectively become a single being. This is like a relationship between two people where they are so strongly entwined, entangled, and enmeshed with one another that they're one of those couples who we almost see as a single entity. They have become so combined and fused that we almost can't comprehend them as separate beings, because they have found that mystical conjunction, that union of opposites in a single being that somehow learned to harmonize with itself and create something entirely new. So like a good hostess, you see these interdependent couples who love one another so much that they can't stand to be out of each other's sight. You know, it would cause them a breakdown if one of them was seated over here and the other was seated over there, because they can't imagine lives without one another. So you say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, that nice conjunct couple, they will sit closely together. I'll even put them on the same chair if they want. You know, she can sit in his lap or the other way around. I don't care. So long as they're kept together, I know that they will be happy and that they will enjoy the dinner party, because their enjoyment of the dinner party depends entirely upon the fusion that they have with one another. When you're looking at the trines and sextiles, these might be guests at the party who you know have a long-standing relationship or friendship with one another, or who don't know one another, but you know there is a common thread between them. You know that they have similar interests, similar temperaments, similar worldviews, and that generally if you seat them adjacent to one another, they're going to have a good time. They're going to have plenty to speak about, and there's not likely to be any disagreements, because with trines, they are usually between signs of the same element. So if you have a trine between, say, Venus in Cancer and Neptune in Pisces, you can say, oh yeah, you know, of course I'll seat the mermaids next to nixies and the water nymphs and the dolphin elementals, they're all water beings. They live in the same realm. They experience and perceive the world in similar ways. They speak the same emotional language. They'll naturally get along well. And then you look at the earth trees and you say, oh, well, obviously I'm going to put the hobgoblins and the dwarves and the gnomes all together, that they're all earthy. They can speak about practical, real-world things. They can, debate the relative economic worth of all their different possessions and homes. That they're going to have plenty of things of mutual accord to speak about. The squares represents the guests who, if you do bring them together, you do so at your own risk. They are the guests who have contrary natures, who have beliefs that are antithetical to one another. You know that if they start talking, whether due to their different opinions, their different natures, their different ways of expressing themselves, there could be arguments, there could be disharmony, that both parties will probably feel uncomfortable with being forced to have anything to do with one another because they live in different worlds. Squares are usually between signs of differing elements but who have the same type, so cardinal, mutable, or fixed. And when you have people who have different elemental natures but some of the same basic type of approaching things, then you can have these resolute conflicts in which both parties refuse to back down and generally cause a lot of hostility and tension and difficulty for everyone around them. So yeah, the dwarves might be quite comfortable next to the gnomes and hobgoblins, all seated as closely to the ground as possible. But if one of them is meant to sit next to a fairy who just keeps jabbering around and doesn't stay still in their seat but keeps flitting around the rafters, they're going to relate to things so differently that they're probably going to piss one another off. The earthy dwarf is going to see the fairy with its big old flights of fancy and say, well, why can't it just stay still? Why can't it just, talk about normal, earthy, grounded, everyday, practical things like the rest of us? Why does it have to go spinning off into the air and talk about all these wild philosophies and theories and, different disquisitions on socioeconomics and what have you? Why can't it just keep it plain and earthy and simple? The fairy in turn is going to look down at the earthy dwarf and say, oh, this dwarf, he's so cumbersome and slow-witted and boring. He has no imagination. He doesn't think about anything that isn't immediately before his senses. Why did they have to seat us together? Why can't I be over there with the other fairies, jabbering away? However, even though squares represent parts of our consciousness, parts of our character that don't easily get along together, that we can't just expect to seat together and see them get along like a house on fire, if the work is put in, usually they can find some common ground and some way of working with one another. There is just a need to overcome resistance and enter into the kind of no man's land of a middle ground. The fairy and dwarf might feel prejudiced or resistant to one another initially, but if they actually took the time to listen to and engage with the other, they might find, okay, I'm never going to entirely like this person or be absolutely like them or be able to relate to them, but there is some value to their differing perception, their different way of approaching things that I could perhaps learn to synthesize with my own. We might not be the most natural of business partners or people you would think to put together in a relationship, but somehow through getting to know one another, through finding ways of looking to interlock our different quirks and peccadillos, we've found a way of making it work that has actually been creative and encouraged us to grow. So whilst a tree doesn't necessarily demand growth, because when two things get along very easily, there's no push and pull, there's no friction, there's nothing saying something about this has to change or develop in order for it to work. It can just be natural, it can be organic, it can be as it is. With the square, it demands that there has to be some change. Something has to be modified, something has to be adjusted, some growth has to occur in order to make these dissonant things find some way of coming to terms with one another. And that is what creativity is all about. It's problem solving. It's this friction that, because it doesn't happen easily, pushes us into new directions and new insights that make us develop as a human being. So our hostess, when she's dealing with the planets in square, isn't going to sit them together or opposite one another. They might be within eye and earshot of one another, and those planets in square are likely to sit at the table, and they might every now and then catch a glimpse of someone who is seated just through a few seats away, and they might glance at them every now and then and think, God, they're so annoying, but weirdly attractive at the same time. But oppositions are completely different. There's still some kind of point of relationship and connection with a square, whereas with an opposition you have total separation. These are two guests who not only might you sit them at totally opposite ends of this big banquet table that everyone is arrayed around, you might even put them in different rooms. They are so different from one another that it's almost like there's a danger that if you brought them together, not only would there be conflict, they might even cancel one another out altogether. There's no room between them on the face of it for any kind of harmonious relationship or connection. It's like if you were arranging a party and you knew you had some shadow people coming and some light beings coming, you're probably not going to want to bring them anywhere near to one another. In psychological terms, an astrological opposition represents a split or schism in consciousness. Two parts of ourselves that, like an emulsion formed of water and oil, we simply cannot get them to combine. No matter how closely we press them together, there is always this mysterious membrane that prevents them from having any kind of interconnectivity. It's like when you get two magnets of the same polarity and try and bring them together, no matter how you push them, there is always that force pushing them further away from one another. So there is attraction and repulsion with astrological opposites, because by the same token, it's almost like they're tied together. So they try and come together, and they are unable to meet. And yet, if they feel repulsed from one another and try and flee from the other, then that chain, that golden thread by which they are connected, drags the other one along behind them. So you can try and come together, and yet there isn't that sacred marriage. You try and pull away, and this thing you are running from starts chasing you even more quickly. Do nothing, and you're just kind of left with this weird homeostasis, this sense of a nagging irresolution that demands some kind of action to which there is no obvious solution. On an experiential level, oppositions tend to create extremes of behavior. When we have these polarized planets in our charts, or which we are experiencing by transit, the fact that you have these dualities that seem to cancel one another out means that either we respond to this conundrum by identifying solely with one polarity and rejecting the other and refusing to believe that it has any presence within us whatsoever, or we have that bigger consciousness where we can see both of those polarities and say, yes, sometimes I am this thing, sometimes I am that thing, and yet there is no middle ground. There is no way I can conceive of in which I can somehow represent and embody the contradictory parts of my personality at the same time. I can only deal with them by the enantiodromia of vacillating between being one extreme and then being the other. So it's almost like this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type situation, where Dr. Jekyll represents civilization, the man who is genteel, considerate, well-mannered, intelligent, scientific, objective, and a good upstanding member of his civilization and the society which he represents. And then Mr. Hyde, who is bestial, murderous, animalistic, rapacious, who's entirely governed by selfishness and the dangerous extremities of his own desire nature, rather than accepting that even if I feel more identified with Dr. Jekyll, there is still a little bit of Mr. Hyde in me that needs to safely come out. Instead, that there is a rejection. Mr. Jekyll says, well, I'm a good person, I'm law-abiding, I'm noble, I'm intellectual. I would never kill anyone, I would never destroy someone, I would never commit a crime, I would never do something hurtful or painful or bad to someone else, I only ever do what's good. Whereas Mr. Hyde sees Dr. Jekyll and thinks he's so effete and weak and genteel and just totally dominated by society and the status quo. I'm nothing like that. I'm a raw animal man. I do what I want and I get what I want and I don't give a fuck about anyone else. I'd never be a namby-pamby weakling like him. Now, if you had Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a conjunction, then what you would get is basically an ordinary human being who's sometimes good, who's sometimes bad, who has some nice characteristics, who is sometimes compassionate and considerate, and other times selfish and aggressive and lazy. You just have an ordinary, complex person who isn't at war with themselves, who accepts that they are multifaceted, that they have all of these different qualities and characteristics. They don't have to be polarized. They don't have to be one or the other. Whereas with polarities and oppositions, we can only deal with them by extremes. And our feelings towards those polarities tends to be ones of love and hate as well, of attraction and repulsion, with no ambiguity or middle ground between them. If you identify with one planetary principle at one end of the opposition, you see the other, and it is somehow the crux of everything that you hate, everything that you fear, everything that you feel threatened by, everything that you refuse to believe has any part in your consciousness or who you are. And yet at the same time, you can see that there is something in this opposite that obsesses you, that you also want, that you crave, that you need, that because there is this imbalance of it in your life, because there is this sense of lack, this malnourishment of this being not existing within you, you have a strong need to have some kind of relationship without you that can then give you this sense of wholeness that you lack if you identify with only one side of the polarity. So the rejected side of a polarity could also equally represent someone or something or some attribute that you actually aspire to. That because it seems so unusual, so other, so disconnected from anything you are or what you've achieved, instead of just hating it, it can also be something that you put on a pedestal. Because you can't find it in yourself, because you can't see it, because you don't believe it's there, because you only encounter it out there in the outer world, you see it as this thing that almost has numinous magical qualities, which if somehow you could find a way of developing it in yourself, could make you feel complete, could make you a whole person. Let's give an example. Let's say there is an opposition between Mercury and the Moon, between the intellectual nature and the emotional nature. And the person who has this opposition identifies 150,000% with Mercury. They see themselves as a rational, curious, analytical, intellectual person who apprehends the world totally through their mind. Anything that they perceive, anything that they experience, anything that they try and understand has to be worked through in a rational, logical, sequential, orderly manner. They refuse to believe that there is anything truly inexplicable or chaotic in the world, but that everything can be apprehended by the power of their mind. And yet, when they meet the moon out there in the world, when they meet these people who aren't intellectual, who are governed entirely by their emotions, by their intuition, by their experience of the world through their feelings, they find themselves bewildered. And they say, well, I'm nothing like that. I never get misled by my emotions. I'm a thoughtful person. You know, the world is explicable, and emotions are so murky and messy and infantile. You know, they're things that babies have, but which any good, sensible person grows out of. There's no order to them. They just swish swash all over the place. You know, I speak to these emotional lunar people, and they're so changeable, they're so moody, they're as happy as sprites one minute and then down in the dumps the next, and then looking at me vengefully and with resentment for something I said. And even though I've analysed what I said, you know, from a million different angles, and I can't see how there's anything that could possibly have offended them, and they're fine and happy and playful again. What's happening with all these changes? Why are they doing this? I can't find any order or reason to you know, how they vacillate between happiness and tears in so fleeting a period of time. And so he rejects the notion that there is any of those lunar qualities within him. And yet, just as he feels repulsed by these people and sees them as being silly and ditzy, he also envies them at the same time, because he can see that there's an experience they're having that he's not. There's a certain innate fairy magic there that doesn't exist in his world of obsessive ratiocination. And he finds that even if he's repelled by these people, he also can't look away from them. He's attracted to them. He feels love and lust for them. He envies the fact that they can be so unthinking, so unself-conscious, that they aren't totally dominated by their minds and thoughts, that they don't need to analyze everything. Sometimes they can just experience them and be happy with the experience. So the mercurial person identifying with that side of the opposition may spend long periods of time where they completely dissociate from their feelings utterly. They're not aware of having any. You know, they see everything through that nice, clean, clarified glass pane of intellectual consciousness and awareness, and they see anyone else who's getting emotional as being silly and infantile. And yet, every now and then, they find, just as they feel really confident and secure with their intellectual superiority and their snobbish attitude towards anyone who is emotional rather than intellectual, periodically they have these bursts where suddenly all those feelings that they've been pretending they don't have all come at once. And, you know, they're in the middle of giving a lecture or watching a documentary, and suddenly they are overcome by emotions. They start crying uncontrollably, and they say, I'm sorry, I don't know what's come over me, I must be sick or mentally deranged or something, this isn't me, this isn't something I normally do, this isn't who I am. So to me, that's one of the trademarks of the opposition, to have an experience of the opposite side and to say, this isn't me. I'm having this experience, but it's not an experience to which I attach my ego. It feels like an invasion. It feels like something from the outside world that has somehow crept within you and possessed you, like the devilish Mr. Hyde, even if it's actually for your own good, because you've denied something that is actually as very much a part of you as the part that you have chosen to identify with. Now let's look at it from the point of view of the moon. The moon meets Mercury and says, they're so cold, calculating, and insensitive and unfeeling. I just don't know how to speak to or relate to this mercurial person. You know, I open up to them, I share my feelings and my experiences, I tell them how I feel about them, and they just close up, they clam up. It's like they don't compute or comprehend what I'm saying, and instead of responding to my emotions or my emotional needs, you know, giving me a hug when I'm sad or entering into my joy when I'm happy, instead they give me long philosophical lectures on Sartre's being or non-being, or start jabbering to me in binary code, or talking to me about quantum mechanics. What do any of those things have to do with us or our relationship? And yet, at the same time, Moon looks at Mercury and goes, Oh, but they're so intelligent. They're so smart. They're so good with their brain. You know, mine is just like a goldfish swimming all over the place. But they're such a genius. They can think through things so quickly. They can see and understand things that me, with my silly little brain, could never understand in a million years. Oh, Mercury, I wish I could be more like you and make more sensible choices in the world and it wasn't entirely dominated by my emotions. So you can see that there is a push and pull there, a love and hate, an admiration and a disgust. All of these warring and conflicting feelings that can never truly be at rest. They're always vacillating, they're always rotating, but they're never quite just entering into an easy stillness. At the very worst, they settle into a totally separate stalemate, where neither moves for fear of setting the other person off. But having got into the basic gist of how oppositions express and feel themselves within a single person, but also out there in the world, manifest as relationships and experiences, maybe let's take some time now to look at the actual damn transit, shall we? Let's start by looking at Venus in opposition to Saturn. Venus represents the principles of relationship, of love, of connecting with others, of diplomacy and compromise, of finding a balance between yourself and others so that you can experience mutuality, pleasure and accord with them. Saturn, on the other side, represents self-sufficiency, isolation, singularity, separation, being a distinct, impregnable entity in your own right and having strong borders over which no one or anything else can cross. For a sprinkling of fairy dust, let's bring these two different planets to life and embody them as two different women and explore the types of lifestyles and characteristics they might have. Venus in Leo is going to be a strong-minded, strong-willed, fiery, passionate young woman who, if she isn't having one long stream of passionate love affairs, one after the other, about which writers or poets would love to compose great works of arts, she's out there with her friends enjoying life, going to the theatre, going to the cinema, going to gigs, going to festivals, engaging in great adventures that will all fulfill her mythic image of herself as someone queenly, someone matriarchal, someone powerful whose light illuminates the world in a unique, special way that no one else could reproduce. But even though she is so strong-willed and independent a woman, she's still Venusian. She still recognizes that she needs people. She needs relationships. She needs contact with others, whether as individuals or groups, to sustain her fires, to keep those passions fueled and to feel like life is truly worth living. So she's a bit perplexed when she sees Saturn in Pisces over there on the other side of the world, this witchy, ethereal, sensitive, emotional being who lives alone in the woods. Instead of living this busy, frivolous, theatrical, active, magnificent, splendiferous lifestyle like Venus in Leo, instead her life is enigmatic, it's secretive, it's evasive. She doesn't seem to need anyone or anything. She seems to be totally self-sufficient and totally self-contained. It's like she has this big wall built around her that no one can cross. Even when you do manage to pin her down and manage to have some kind of one-to-one relationship with her, there's none of that easy warmth and grace and genial humour that you expect when you're interacting with Venus in Leo. You have this feeling of her not being quite there, of being a bit cold, withdrawn, aloof, of not really opening up to you. And yet the fact that she isn't opening up to you, that she isn't just passionately pouring out however she's feeling in a theatrical manner, gives an air of glamour to her. She's secretive, she's enigmatic, she's full of unknowns. There's this sense that she could be totally left alone in the world and yet still strong and capable of and able to find meaning in living this solitary existence, which others would find depressing or lack the strength and self-sufficiency to do well. So when Venus in Leo looks over at Saturn in Pisces, she has mixed feelings. On the one hand, she sees this crone, this witchy woman living alone in the woods, and she thinks, how does she manage it? How does she manage to live alone? Doesn't she get lonely? Doesn't she get sad? Her life looks like a lot of toil and hard work. Doesn't she wish that she could, meet people and have relationships and have love affairs and have contact with other people who could lighten her load and inject it with a bit more light and fun? Why does she just work so hard out there depending on herself? Why doesn't she come over here and party with us and have a good chat? She seems so cold and so distant. I feel like if I brought her along to a party, she would just be a buzzkill, because she would lack the social graces that I possess. She wouldn't know how to just joke and do these carefree things. And yet at the same time, much as Venus in Leo loves her own glamorous, fun-filled lifestyle, she also looks over at Saturn in Pisces and thinks, oh, I wish I could be a bit more like that. I wish I wasn't so needy, that I wasn't so dependent on love and passion and sex and all of these things to keep my life exciting and dramatic. I wish there was a bit more quietude in me, that I was able to find some kind of peace and solace in silence, in solitude, in being alone, in just exploring and enjoying the rich inner depths of my own being, instead of always having to go charging out for it out there like a knight fighting against a dragon. She seems to know something that I don't know. She seems to possess secrets and arcane knowledge about the mysteries of the universe, which seem so alien to me. But maybe I'm missing out. Maybe if I knew more of those things, it would fill some of the lack that all of this outer excitement just doesn't seem able to plug. I wish I could be more dependent on myself, that I didn't always need lovers and other people, that I could just be enough for myself, that I could have that discipline, that patience, that commitment to a long-term goal and vision and aesthetic of life to feel like I was totally in control of myself, because a lot of the time I don't feel in control of myself. I feel like my passions get the better of me, that my desires keep pulling me in one direction after another, and that they are like these flaming beasts within me that I have to obey. When I wish I could be like her. She doesn't seem to have these querulous desires flaming and snapping and making her restless. She seems to be able to just take solace in natural and supernatural beauties that I can neither see nor conceive of. How do I be like that? How do I find that in myself? And Saturn in Pisces, on the other side, looks over at Venus in Leo. She's always on the pages of some fancy fashion magazine. There's always gossip columns about her, about whatever love affair she's had with a great celebrity this week, and who else she's had a big drama or beef or falling out with. The news about her next big dress. Her Instagram story is always overflowing with the most amazing photos, and she thinks, this woman's frivolous. All she cares about is having an audience to document every last part of her life. She can't just sit still and look within. She's always going to go charging out there. What's wrong with her? She just seems so flighty and superficial and not in command of herself. It's she's just gadding about, and she's going to hurt herself, and she's going to hurt other people as well. And yet secretly as well, Saturn in Pisces feels jealous. She wishes she knew how to connect with other people, but she just feels this great fear that if she gave herself to anyone else, if she allowed herself to lower the portcullis of her soul, to come out of her solitude, then she might get rejected, she might get hurt, she might fall in love with someone and lose her autonomy, lose her self-control, lose her self-respect, lose her pride. She'd get humiliated, she'd be the plaything of someone else's feelings and impulses. At least if I stay here alone in the woods by myself, no one can get close to me and therefore no one can hurt me. And yet at the same time I feel the absence of those relationships. I feel the absence of contact with other people. I feel starved of physical touch and of emotional contact with someone else. What if all my feelings and what if all my desires and fantasies, what if I didn't just have to keep them to myself? What if there was someone I could be close to and feel some warmth and passion with? And I'm tired of having to carry so much by myself, to always be in control, to always be so disciplined and well-contained and well-ordered, and, getting up every day to meditate for 3 hours and opening my eyes and still finding that I'm alone, that there's no one there to lighten my load or to share life with. I wish I could be like her, that I could just let go and be free and easy and find joy in life instead of just seeing it as this hardship that I have to get through and endure and weather alone because that's all I've ever known. Now, it must be remembered that if someone has an opposition between Venus and Saturn in their natal charts, then both of these women are going to live inside of them. There's going to be both of them in there. And yet, as always, they may identify more comfortably with one rather than the other, depending on the biases and the disposition of the rest of the chart, as well as the experiences that they've had and which part of them have been encouraged and which have been rewarded. But let's say this person feels most comfortable with being Venus in Leo. And because they refuse to believe that this Saturnine, self-sufficient, solitary, mysterious woman exists within them, they only ever encounter it as other people out there in the world who they are attracted to. And so, this fiery woman, she keeps falling in love with Saturnine people. Even though she's so fiery herself, there's just something about these people who seem so cool and composed and mysterious and secretive and self-contained that just really gets her going. She knows on some level that they're not the ideal kind of person for her, and yet there's something about the mysteries that they seem to contain, the deep emotions, the deep feelings and magical sensuality that must lurk within as sacred waters behind that stony mask that she just really wants to go beyond. In fact, because these Saturnine people seem to not be as easily charmed by her as everyone else in the world, only makes them even more beguiling. Everyone else is fascinated by her magnetism and charm. There's millions of other people who would happily throw themselves at her feet and die for her, but she doesn't want them. She wants these Saturn people who, every time she tries to come close to them, every time she tries to give them her heart, to try and win them over through being funny and theatrical or making them laugh or serenading them with music and trying to inject a bit of theatre and drama in their life, they seem to step back. And the more passionate and ardent she is, the more withdrawn and mysterious and self-contained they become. And she feels driven to try and overcome these obstacles, to try and overcome these blockages. And yet eventually she has to admit defeat, that these people just don't want me. They don't like me, they don't see me, they don't love me, they don't accept me for who I am. And sometimes she steps back a bit and suddenly the Saturn people take an interest and she thinks, what's going on here? Now that I've stopped trying, they come forward. So she gets excited and she leaps forward again and becomes more passionate and outgoing and loving again, and they withdraw again. And she thinks, oh, for fuck's sake, this is never going to work, is it? And all of that Saturnine resistance that she meets out there starts making her feel depressed and frustrated, and she no longer feels so fiery and passionate and confident and sure of herself and her own magnetism and charm. And she gets tired of putting herself out there all the time and being so extroverted, and so she starts to withdraw. She starts to be more guarded and more closed around people. she starts to feel that other people can't be depended upon because they'll always reject you. So you need to look after yourself. You need to look after number one first, and you can only do that if you have all your shit together, if any needs in your life are ones that you can meet. So she just loses herself in her work and does lots of psychological work on herself and starts keeping other people at bay. And before she knows it, she is Saturn in Pisces. She is this person who rejected her. She is the Saturn that she refused to believe she was herself. So this is part of the weird enantiodromia of opposites. Through rejecting or feeling rejected by that quality in someone else or by something else in the world, we kind of automatically end up becoming more of that thing to deal with the loss of not being able to have it out there. Then if we looked at it from the other point of view, if you had someone who was feeling mostly like the Saturn in Pisces, they're keeping themselves to themselves. They've decided that the single life is for them. They would rather just look after themselves and their own needs and their own career and whatever else they contribute to society and not worry about relationships because they're only bound to disappoint you. Anyone you get close to is always going to desert you, so what's the point? It's a lot of energy that I just can't deal with the fallout from. I would rather just focus on what is in my control. Just look after me and my own lifestyle. And yet, one day while she's alone in her cabin with her woods, a traveller comes by. And it's Venus in Leo. Who would have thought it? Of all the coincidences in the world. And she sees her and she's just so magical and zesty and full of life. She makes her feel things that she hasn't felt for years. When she's in her presence, she doesn't feel as alone. There's a liveliness there. She feels like she can relax and unwind more. She made her laugh when she's normally feels so serious. Instead of feeling so self-contained, she could feel some of her walls beginning to come down. There was a little spark of something there that was within her, but which she'd never noticed before, that made her see that life could be a different way, that maybe I don't have to live alone in the woods. And she rejects that idea initially, thinking, well, no, that was just a crazy moment. I was feeling charmed by this superficial person, but there's nothing there. It's not a genuine attraction. It was just a fleeting moment of infatuation. I'm in Saturn in Pisces. I know that all things are transient, all things are ephemeral, all things disappear in the end. So why get attached to something that's ephemeral? That's stupid. I'm much better remaining focused on myself and my own personal development, because those are the few things that are within my control. And yet she can't stop thinking about Venus and Leo, and she thinks, oh God, I can't just sit around waiting for her to come to the cabin again. If I want her, if I want to be in a relationship with her, I've got to meet her on her own terms. I've got to go out there into the world. But she's never going to pay attention to me while I'm wearing these very practical, ordinary clothes. She dresses colourfully. I'll have to start being more colourful and extroverted and outgoing and going to parties and going on adventures and going to all these places that she goes to and learning how to socialise with people and to be more fun-loving and spontaneous and learn how to just trust in the moment and enjoy those sudden uprisings of passions and just trusting they'll lead you where they need to lead you, instead of always just thinking about the end results and seeing everything in those terms. What about the now? What about the moment? And before you know it, she has egged herself into being Venus in Leo. In order to attract the thing that she wanted, she's made herself into what she's attracted to. So to step outside of the theatrics for a moment, on an experiential level, Venus opposite Saturn can represent the need for love and relationships and connectivity with one another, and the need to be solitary, separate, well-defined, and completely self-sufficient are equally strong. And so this person feels themselves to really need a relationship, to really need love, to really need other people. And yet there's a part of her that's terrified that if she really does allow herself to love and give herself to someone else, then she will lose her autonomy, she will lose her self-command and self-mastery and discipline and all the order that she's made in life. And because of that, she may end up creating this rejection scenario because she's afraid of losing her control to someone else. When she does start to experience it, when she does start to feel love or closeness with someone else, she may suddenly feel the need to withdraw, to run away, to put up barriers with them, or to constantly find faults or in the other person that mean that either relationship couldn't work, or to see signs that maybe that person doesn't love them, they don't like them, and they're going to reject them. So the best thing that they could do to maintain their own autonomy is to reject the other person in advance. And then they do that, and then they bemoan the fact that they don't have a relationship. So you have these two equally strong needs that can never quite let the other person rest. Anyway, speaking of rest, I need to do a little sum. I would ideally like to spend more time exploring the Venus opposite Saturn aspect. I may well do in another video, but right now I'm hungry and I'm going to eat the soup I made. If you want to talk about any of the oppositions you experience in your own chart, I would love to hear from you. Especially as I don't have any real major oppositions in my chart. Depends how you look at it. I have Venus opposite the ascendant, but you could equally look at that as Venus conjunct the descendant in the 7th house. I have Chiron and Saturn opposite one another, but yeah, let's not go into that for now. I'd love to hear how you experience your own oppositions and different ways in which you've tried to work with them or against them, and the repeating stories and patterns they've created in your lives. If you want to message me for more personal counselling and advice, you can email me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. You can follow me on Instagram at astrology and underwear, and you can support me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thestarsunraveled.